Nobody expected him back in the cockpit. Not after the doctors had amputated both his legs 6 inches above the knee. Not after the RAF had declared him permanently unfit for flying duties. And certainly not after he'd been told he would never walk properly again, let alone pilot a fighter aircraft. But Squadron Leader DouglasBAder had a different opinion about what was possible. What the Luftwaffe pilots didn't know, as they watched the aggressive Spitfire diving toward them with lethal precision, was that the man trying to kill them had no legs at all. December 14, 1931. Flying Officer DouglasBAder was 21 years old, a natural pilot with reflexes that bordered on supernatural, and absolutely convinced of his own invincibility. He'd been flying for 3 years and had never met an aircraft he couldn't master, or a maneuver he couldn't perfect. That confidence nearly killed him. Bader was attempting low-level aerobatics over Woodley Aerodrome in his Avro 504, pushing the aircraft through a series of rolls and loops that had become routine for him. But routine bred carelessness, and carelessness in aviation was usually fatal. Coming out of a particularly aggressive roll at less than 50 feet altitude, Bader misjudged his height and clipped the ground with his wingtip. The crash happened so fast that witnesses later disagreed about the exact sequence of events. The aircraft cartwheeled across the grass, shedding pieces of wing and fuselage, before finally coming to rest in a twisted pile of metal and fabric. Bader was unconscious when they pulled him from the wreckage, both legs mangled beyond recognition, blood soaking into the winter grass. At the Royal Berkshire Hospital, the doctors delivered their verdict with the clinical detachment that medical professionals use to mask their own horror. Both legs would have to be amputated. The right leg above the knee, the left leg even higher. At 21, DouglasBAder's flying career was over before it had properly begun, except that nobody had bothered to explain this to Bader himself. The first thing he said when he regained consciousness was, "When can I fly again?" The doctors assumed it was delirium caused by trauma and pain medication. They were wrong. Bader had made a decision while lying in that hospital bed, a decision that would define the rest of his remarkable life. He was going to fly again, regardless of what medical science or military regulations said about men with no legs. The rehabilitation process that followed was a study in stubborn determination that amazed everyone who witnessed it. Learning to walk on artificial legs was supposed to take months of careful, gradual adjustment. Bader did it in weeks, approaching the challenge with the same aggressive confidence he'd brought to flying. He fell down hundreds of times, but he got up hundreds and one times. More importantly, he never stopped thinking like a pilot. While other amputees focused on learning to walk, Bader was studying how his artificial legs would affect his ability to operate rudder pedals, how the lack of feeling in his feet would change his approach to landings, how he could compensate for the loss of natural balance that came from legs he could feel. 6 months after the crash, Bader walked into the office of his commanding officer without crutches, without assistance, and with a formal request to return to flying duties. The commanding officer took one look at him and said what everyone expected him to say: "Impossible. The RAF doesn't fly pilots with artificial legs." Bader's response was characteristically direct. "Then the RAF is missing out on a bloody good pilot." What followed was a bureaucratic battle that lasted nearly 2 years. Bader underwent medical examination after medical examination, each one designed to prove that a man with artificial legs could not safely operate a military aircraft. Bader passed every test, but the regulations were clear. Amputation meant immediate medical discharge from flying duties. In 1933, DouglasBAder was invalided out of the Royal Air Force with a disability pension, and the assumption that his flying days were permanently over. The assumption was correct for exactly 7 years. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, the RAF was desperately short of experienced pilots. The Luftwaffe had been building its strength for years, while Britain had only recently begun to take the threat seriously. Every man who could fly a fighter aircraft was needed, regardless of medical technicalities that might have seemed important during peacetime. Bader presented himself at the nearest RAF recruiting office and volunteered for immediate active duty. The recruiting officer looked at his service record, looked at his artificial legs, and said exactly what Bader expected him to say: "I'm sorry, But the regulations haven't changed. Then change the bloody regulations, Bader replied. It took 6 months of lobbying, string pulling and bureaucratic warfare. But eventually someone in the Air Ministry decided that desperate times called for flexible interpretations of medical fitness standards. In February 1940, Squadron Leader DouglasBAder was officially returned to flying status and assigned to No. 19 Squadron, flying Supermarine Spitfires. His squadron mates were initially skeptical about the new arrival with the artificial legs and the reputation for being difficult with authority. Their skepticism evaporated the first time they saw him fly. Bader approached aerial combat with the same aggressive determination he'd brought to his rehabilitation. He flew his Spitfire like a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove, pushing the aircraft and himself to limits that made other pilots nervous just to watch. His artificial legs, which everyone had assumed would be a disadvantage, actually gave him certain unexpected benefits. He couldn't feel the crushing G-forces that affected his legs during high-speed maneuvers, allowing him to maintain consciousness longer during extreme aerial combat. The Luftwaffe first encountered Squadron Leader Bader during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, German. Pilots began reporting a particularly aggressive British fighter pilot who seemed to appear from nowhere, engage multiple aircraft simultaneously, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The pilot flew with a distinctive style, violent, precise, and absolutely fearless. What the German pilots didn't realize was that they were encountering a man who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to a pilot and decided that everything else was just varying degrees of manageable risk. Bader's first confirmed kill came on July 11, 1940, during a raid on German bomber formations, attacking British shipping in the English Channel. Flying as part of a 3-aircraft section, Bader engaged a formation of Dornier bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt fighters. The battle was brief but decisive. Bader shot down 2 German aircraft and damaged a third before Ypres. Disengaging and returning to base, his squadron commander's report noted that Bader had displayed exceptional flying ability and complete disregard for personal safety. It was the first of many such reports. Over the following months, Bader's reputation grew throughout the RAF and, gradually within German intelligence circles, Luftwaffe pilots began reporting encounters with a British fighter pilot who seemed immune to fear and incapable of retreat. German intelligence officers, analyzing pilot reports and combat film, identified a pattern of tactics that suggested an unusually skilled and experienced British pilot operating in the sector. They had no idea that the pilot they were tracking had no legs. By March 1941, Bader had been promoted to wing commander and given command of the Tangmere Wing, 3 squadrons of Spitfire fighters responsible for sweeps over occupied France. It was during this period that Bader developed the tactical innovations that would make him one of the most effective fighter commanders of the war. Traditional RAF tactics called for fighters to fly in tight formations that looked impressive but were actually vulnerable to attack. Bader advocated for loose formations that gave individual pilots more freedom to maneuver and engage targets of opportunity. He also insisted on aggressive tactics that brought British fighters directly into combat with German formations, rather than waiting to respond to German initiatives. The results were dramatic. Under Bader's leadership, the Tangmere Wing achieved one of the highest kill ratios of any RAF fighter unit, destroying German aircraft at a rate that began to seriously concern Luftwaffe commanders. More importantly, Bader's tactics were being adopted by other RAF units, fundamentally changing how British fighters approached aerial combat. German intelligence became increasingly interested in the British pilot, who seemed to be behind these tactical innovations. Intercepted radio communications suggested that British pilots were receiving detailed tactical instructions from a commander they referred to as DB or Dog's Body, Bader's radio call sign. Luftwaffe intelligence officers began building a profile of this mysterious British commander, not knowing that they were trying to understand a man whose very existence defied their assumptions about what was possible. The profile they developed was remarkably accurate in some ways and completely wrong in others. They correctly identified Bader as an experienced pre-war pilot who had returned to service after the war began. They correctly assessed that he was an innovative tactical thinker who was influencing RAF combat doctrine. They correctly determined that he was personally responsible for a significant number of German aircraft losses. What they never suspected was that their most dangerous opponent was a double amputee who should have been medically incapable of flying at all. Bader's war came to an abrupt end on August 9, 1941, during a fighter sweep over northern France. Leading a formation of Spitfires in an attack on German positions near Le Touquet, Bader's aircraft collided with a Messerschmitt fighter during a high-speed engagement. Both aircraft were destroyed, but while the German pilot died in the crash, Bader managed to bail out at the last second. The parachute descent gave Bader time to consider his situation, which was complicated by factors that would not have affected any other RAF pilot. His artificial legs, designed for walking rather than parachuting, had been damaged in the collision and bailout sequence. When he landed in a French wheat field, he discovered that one of his legs was completely unusable and the other was barely functional. German soldiers found him an hour later, sitting calmly in the shade of a farmhouse, smoking a cigarette and apparently unconcerned about his capture. The German officer who took his surrender later wrote that the British pilot seemed remarkably composed for a man who had just lost his aircraft and his freedom. What the German officer didn't realize was that Bader had lost much more than that over the years and learned to adapt. The German authorities were initially puzzled by their prisoner. Squadron leader DouglasBAder was clearly an experienced and valuable RAF pilot, but his artificial legs raised questions about British military medical standards that German intelligence found difficult to understand. How had a double amputee been cleared for combat flying? Was this some sort of British deception operation? Or were the RAF so desperate for pilots that they were using disabled personnel? The puzzle deepened when German intelligence began comparing their prisoner with the mysterious DB, whose tactical innovations had been causing so much trouble for the Luftwaffe. Radio intercepts and pilot debriefings had suggested that this commander was one of the most effective British fighter leaders, but the man in custody appeared to be a medical curiosity rather than a tactical genius. It took several weeks of interrogation before German intelligence accepted the truth. The pilot they had been tracking for months, the tactical innovator who had revolutionized RAF fighter operations, the aggressive commander whose wing had achieved one of the highest kill ratios in the RAF, was the same double amputee who was now sitting in their prisoner of war camp, calmly requesting better prosthetic legs so he could walk around the compound more effectively. The German response to this revelation was a mixture of professional respect and complete bewilderment. Luftwaffe officers who had flown against Bader expressed genuine admiration for his flying skills and tactical ability. German medical personnel were fascinated by the prosthetic technology that had allowed him to fly at all. Prison camp commandants found themselves dealing with a prisoner who seemed constitutionally incapable of accepting captivity as a permanent condition. Bader's first escape attempt came within 6 weeks of his capture. Using tools smuggled from the camp workshop, he and several other RAF officers had constructed a tunnel from their barracks to a point beyond the perimeter fence. The tunnel was discovered hours before the planned escape, but German investigators were impressed by the engineering sophistication of the project. More escape attempts followed. Bader seemed to view imprisonment as simply another challenge to be overcome through planning, determination, and complete disregard for the consequences of failure. German security officers noted that he appeared to spend most of his time studying guard routines, analyzing security procedures, and developing increasingly elaborate escape plans. The artificial legs that had enabled Bader's flying career now became the focus of an unusual psychological warfare campaign. German prison authorities realized that by confiscating his prosthetic legs, they could effectively immobilize their most troublesome prisoner. Bader, with characteristic directness, informed them that removing his legs would not prevent escape attempts. It would simply make them more creative. To prove his point, Bader's next escape attempt involved lowering himself from a second-story window using knotted bed sheets, then crawling several hundred yards to the perimeter fence, where he attempted to cut through the wire, using a smuggled hacksaw blade. The attempt failed when guards spotted him, but German reports noted that he had covered nearly half a mile on his hands and knees in complete darkness, demonstrating remarkable determination and physical endurance. The German solution was both practical and unprecedented. They contacted the British Red Cross and arranged for BAder to receive new, higher-quality prosthetic legs, then kept the legs locked in the commandant's office, except during designated exercise periods. It was probably the only time in military history that prosthetic limbs were used as a security measure in a prisoner-of-war camp. BAder's response was to organize the other prisoners into a systematic intelligence-gathering operation that monitored German security procedures, guard schedules, and camp routines with military precision. When German officers realized what was happening, they found themselves in the unprecedented situation of trying to maintain security against a prisoner who was applying professional military tactics to the problem of escape planning. The situation became so complex that senior German officers began visiting the camp specifically to meet the legendary legless pilot whose escape attempts had become the subject of bemused reports throughout the Wehrmacht. Luftwaffe generals who had lost aircraft to BAder's wing wanted to meet the man who had caused them so much trouble. German medical officers were fascinated by the prosthetic technology that had enabled his flying career. One Luftwaffe general, after meeting BAder during a camp inspection, reportedly told his staff, "This man has no legs, but he is more dangerous in a prison camp than most of our pilots are in the air." The assessment was not entirely wrong. BAder's influence on prisoner morale and escape planning had turned the camp into a training ground for resistance operations. British prisoners were learning advanced techniques for intelligence gathering, security analysis, and coordinated action that would prove valuable if they were eventually liberated or if they succeeded in escaping. German authorities eventually transferred BAder to Colditz Castle, a high-security facility reserved for persistent escapers and politically sensitive prisoners. The transfer was accompanied by a detailed security analysis that recommended constant surveillance and immediate confiscation of any materials that could be used for tunnel construction, lock-picking, or prosthetic leg modification. Even at Colditz, surrounded by the most sophisticated security measures the Germans could devise, BAder continued planning escape attempts with the same methodical determination he had brought to aerial combat. Prison guards noted that he seemed to view security measures not as obstacles, but as problems to be analyzed and solved. The war ended before BAder could complete his most ambitious escape plan, which involved coordinating a mass breakout with simultaneous diversionary activities designed to overwhelm camp security. German records discovered after the war revealed that prison authorities had been preparing to transfer him to an even more secure facility, having concluded that keeping DouglasBAder in any conventional prison camp was like trying to contain a force of nature. When Allied forces liberated Colditz in April 1945, they found BAder calmly organizing the other prisoners into military formations, preparing to march out of captivity with the same discipline they had brought to their resistance efforts. His first request to the liberating officers was for transportation back to Britain so he could return to flying duties. The RAF medical board that examined BAder after his repatriation reached the same conclusion their predecessors had reached in 1933. Men with artificial legs could not safely fly military aircraft. BAder's response was the same as it had been 12 years earlier. He requested a test flight to prove them wrong. This time, however, the test flight was approved. On a grey morning in June 1945, squadron leader DouglasBAder climbed back into the cockpit of a Spitfire for the first time in nearly 4 years. Ground crews watched nervously as he ran through his pre-flight checks, started the engine, and taxied toward the runway. 20 minutes later, after a flight that included aerobatics that would have been challenging for a pilot with normal legs, BAder landed and climbed out of the aircraft with a broad grin. His comment to the medical board was characteristically direct. "Gentlemen, I believe I've just proved that reports of my flying death have been greatly exaggerated." The medical board, faced with evidence that contradicted every assumption they had made about disabled pilots, officially cleared BAder for return to flying duties. It was a decision that would have far-reaching implications for military aviation and disability rights, though nobody fully understood that at the time. DouglasBAder continued flying for the RAF until 1946, when he retired from military service with the rank of Group Captain. His final logbook entry recorded over 2,000 hours of military flying time, 22 confirmed aerial victories, and participation in some of the most crucial air battles of World War II. The entry made no mention of the fact that most of this had been accomplished by a man with no legs. After the war, DouglasBAder became one of Britain's most famous veterans, though he consistently refused to be treated as a symbol of overcoming disability. His standard response to such suggestions was that losing his legs had been inconvenient, not tragic, and that focusing on what he couldn't do missed the point of what he had accomplished. In speeches to veteran groups and aviation organizations, DouglasBAder emphasized that his success as a pilot had nothing to do with inspiration or special courage. It had everything to do with refusing to accept other people's definitions of what was possible and being too stubborn to quit when things became difficult. The legs were never the real issue, he would tell audiences. The issue was whether I was going to let other people decide what I could and couldn't do based on their assumptions about what normal looked like. DouglasBAder's influence on aviation went far beyond his personal flying achievements. The tactical innovations he had developed during his command of the Tangmere Wing became standard RAF doctrine and influenced fighter tactics throughout NATO. His approach to aggressive, flexible fighter operations was studied in Air Force academies around the world. More importantly, his example changed military attitudes toward disabled personnel. The success of a double amputee in one of the most physically demanding military roles forced military medical establishments to reconsider their assumptions about physical fitness standards and combat effectiveness. DouglasBAder died in 1982, still flying light aircraft at the age of 72. His final flight was in a vintage Spitfire at an air show commemorating the Battle of Britain. Witnesses reported that his landing was as smooth and precise as anything he had accomplished during his combat career 40 years earlier. The Spitfire that DouglasBAder flew on his final flight is now displayed in the Royal Air Force Museum, next to a plaque that summarizes his extraordinary career. The plaque mentions his 22 aerial victories, his tactical innovations, his escape attempts from German prison camps, and his influence on military aviation doctrine. What the plaque doesn't mention, because DouglasBAder would have insisted on its removal, is that all of this was accomplished by a man who had been told repeatedly and authoritatively that he would never fly again. DouglasBAder proved that the most dangerous assumption you can make about human potential is that you understand its limits. He showed that physical disability is often less limiting than mental acceptance of other people's expectations. Most importantly, he demonstrated that the only real disability is the willingness to accept defeat as permanent. The Luftwaffe pilots who encountered DouglasBAder during the Battle of Britain never knew they were fighting a man with no legs. They only knew they were facing someone who flew with a skill and aggressiveness that pushed their own abilities to the limit. In the end, that was exactly how DouglasBAder wanted to be remembered. Not as a disabled pilot who overcame adversity, but as a pilot who happened to be disabled and refused to let that fact define what he could accomplish. His legacy lives on in every military pilot who refuses to accept conventional limitations, every disabled person who insists on defining their own capabilities, and every individual who understands that the word impossible is usually just another word for difficult. Squadron leader DouglasBAder taught the world that losing your legs doesn't mean losing your ability to soar.